Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the next installment of our Themes of the Upper Story series. This one on chapters 27 and 28. Before we get to that, just a few housekeeping details. One is that I will be going out of town from October the 18th through November the 2nd. I will try to get all of the manuscript notes up onto the website and to complete the videos so that you'll have access to those. Everything is accessible from the Discipleship Group's website at the following URL. All right, let's get into the story. Chapter 27 is entitled The Resurrection and, of course, talks about the resurrection of Jesus. A couple of key questions out of your guide. The first one is a personal question, and I encourage you not to skip it. That question is, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and why? I encourage you not to skip that question, partly because your groups are about more than information. Those of us who take the Bible seriously, it's clear that Jesus did rise from the dead. However, you may find that in your group, people have all kinds of thoughts about whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, or if they believe that he did, what that means. Sometimes people want to say, yes, I believe in the resurrection, I believe that Jesus lives on, but then as you kind of probe a little bit, ask some questions, you start to realize that what they really mean is that the memory of Jesus lives on, and that in some sense, as long as we remember him, as long as we cherish his teachings, his values, that he lives on in all of us. And, I don't want to put that down as a point of view. I will simply say that the Bible teaches us something substantially different than that. The Bible teaches us that Jesus rose from the dead bodily. As a university student and not yet a Christian, the first time I ran into people that believed that, it just blew me away. I was a biology major, a scientist, and I just could not imagine that educated, intelligent people really believed that Jesus not only died, but that he rose from the dead and was living today and still doing stuff. And so that's a conversation that's definitely worth having. I encourage you not to sort of judge harshly or put one another down. You really want to know what people believe, and you want to know why. And there could be all kinds of reasons why. It could be because of what the Bible says. It could be because of their experience of Jesus still doing things, still speaking to them, answering prayers, that sort of thing. Could be because they are committed to a scientific, a materialistic worldview that says that everything that's real are things that we can taste, touch, see, and smell, and feel. But whatever the reasoning is, you want to know where the people in your group are really at. So don't put them down for it, but encourage vulnerability and honesty. It's not that all the opinions are equally true. If they were, I wouldn't be doing what I do for a living. However, it takes time for some people to be able to process all of the data, and I believe that if people will give the data a fair chance, not just the Bible, but if you weigh out the circumstances surrounding Jesus' death and what happened after that, I think there's a very good case to be made that Jesus really did rise from the dead and is living today. The second question from the guide that I think would be great to talk about is this one that says, go and make disciples of all nations. What does this mean? And what does Jesus want us to do to fulfill this calling? I think that is a critical question because Jesus is doing more than just rescuing us. Jesus is making us a part of his team. in the world. And Jesus is at work in the world, accomplishing a mission of making all things new. And we are called to be a part of that by making disciples. And so I would break that statement down. Don't take any of it for granted. Jesus says, go. What does he mean when he says go? I think it might mean that we don't just try to make disciples in all the normal places that we would be anyway. We should do it there too, but we are called to go. And then he says to make disciples. What does it mean to make disciples? He could have said to make believers. He could have said to make church attenders, but he doesn't say that. He says to make disciples. And so you could answer that question, what is a disciple and what does it mean to be a person who can make disciples? Finally, he says to make disciples of all nations. And what does that mean for us? I know that some of us have been taught that it makes sense to focus on people that we are more like because we connect with them easier, because we see the world the same way. And so whether that's me as a Chinese guy, English-speaking Chinese guy, or whether it's me as a man or me as a college-educated person or me as a professional, to try to reach out to those kind of people. And I certainly wouldn't discourage you from that. But Jesus' call is for us to make disciples of all nations. And what does that mean? Not necessarily for you specifically to make disciples of all nations, although you might, but for us to make disciples of all nations. What does that look like? I think it's important to think about the difference between being a person who attends a church or being a person who attends a discipleship group and being a person who actually is a disciple and is proactively pursuing the life of a disciple of Jesus. And then there's even a difference between that and being a person who is making disciples, or at least trying to make disciples. In future videos, we'll talk some about what that looks like to make disciples. But let me just say this for this particular video. It's not going to happen by accident. We need to have a certain amount of intentionality. And just because we're trying to make disciples doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. But if we don't even try, if we don't even pray that God will do it, if we don't even put ourselves in a position with intentionally focusing on someone to help them to grow in Jesus, to help them to grow as a disciple, we can be pretty sure that it will only happen sporadically at best. Let's talk upper and lower story. I think if we think about the story of Jesus, a great lower story ending would have been for Jesus to somehow escape when these guys were torturing him and beating him and getting ready to publicly crucify him, that he somehow would have survived it, gotten away, and then led his side to victory. I think the disciples would have loved that. It would have fit their picture of Messiah. But in the upper story, death is actually the key to victory. And Jesus does not skip death. He doesn't find a way around death. But he faces death squarely, and he meets it head on, and he takes its terrible weight upon himself, and then he defeats it for all time. That can have all kinds of applications for us. But I think just from the beginning, it's important to note that in the upper story, God goes about things in ways that are not intuitive for us, not the way that we might normally approach them. And I think in our lives, we need to get used to the idea that we also need to die and be raised to the newness of life, as it says in Romans chapter 6. Some of you have heard me share that in our baptism class, that baptism is a picture of what happens to us in Jesus, that our old life is buried with Jesus into death, and that we are raised to walk in the newness of life. And so that is not just semantics. We are not just talking about reforming ourselves, trying to get a little bit better than we used to be. We're not taking the old self and trying to improve it. Jesus is not in the improvement business. We're talking about dying and being raised by the power of God. The power of God who comes to live in us and to help us to live a supernatural way. One of my favorite verses is Romans 5:10, which says, if while we were his enemies, we were reconciled to God, we were reconciled to the Father through the death of his Son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And so a lot of Christians, they make a big deal out of the death of Jesus, but it is the life of Jesus in us that saves us. And we are supposed to be living a supernaturally empowered life. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It's what it means to be a Christian. So, are you living that kind of a life? All right, chapter 28 is called New Beginnings. It's a new beginning for the disciples, and it's a new beginning because this is where the church is founded. You'll note that at the beginning of chapter 28, there's this little inscription to Theophilus. This is actually from the beginning of Acts. And what you'll find is that it sounds a lot like the inscription at the beginning of Luke. Because Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. It's kind of a two-part, the beginning of the story and then the sequel to that same story. What Jesus began to do and teach, and then what he continued to do through his Spirit working in the church. So, some key questions that you might talk about in your group. One of them is not really in the guide. It's several of the questions kind of crushed together to form one question, which was, how have the disciples' lives changed? I was talking about a supernaturally empowered life, about an old life that is put to death and being raised to a new kind of life. And we see this in the disciples who, at one point, there at the late part of the Gospels, were fearful and timid. They were hiding out for fear of being caught. You know, the authorities had already killed Jesus, and you know, if they'd been out in public, there's a pretty good chance that they too would be arrested and then eventually killed. You know, somebody turned them into an example. But what we find here is that the disciples are no longer fearful. They're no longer timid, but they have become bold and spiritually powerful. They're there preaching in front of large crowds. They're doing miracles and unashamedly facing the authorities and saying, you've got to do what you've got to do, and we have to do what God says to do. And they let the chips fall where they may. It's not just bravado, and in fact, some of the disciples who said those things were martyred shortly after that. So it's a dangerous thing to say. Eventually, of the surviving 11 apostles, 10 of them were martyred, and they tried to martyr John. It didn't work out, but so he survived what they did to him. But yeah, we're not talking about just talking tough. We're talking about being willing to risk your life. Now, the other question that is in the guide is, or I guess this isn't in the guide either. Anyway, I think it's worth talking about what stands out about their relationships and their mission. What do you notice about their life together? How is it different, both than what their life was like before, but also than what life is like typically in the world? It was different then, and it's different now. And the question of how we as a church compare to their kind of life, I think, should be a convicting one, a startling one, because I'm not convinced at all that we even try to live that kind of life. Let's talk upper story and lower story. One of the great apologetics, the great arguments for Jesus being alive and still active through his Spirit is the transformation of the disciples and the founding of the church. The fact that the church exists today after they killed Jesus, it looked like that was pretty much the end. The disciples were few, they were hiding out, and to get from there to where we are today is a pretty astonishing thing. We see it even in Acts, or this chapter 28 of the story, how much their lives have changed and how quickly the movement grew. Is that possible apart from the power of God? I also think that the quality of their life together demonstrates that God is at work, because the kind of life that they have together, the way they share their material possessions, the way that they stand boldly in the face of opposition and persecution, the way that they work out their differences and hang together as one. All of those things, to me, are evidence of God at work. And I believe that this is still what the world needs to see today. The church has fallen in love with technology and with methods, trying to find some way to get people to come into church and to find some way to sell them the message of Jesus. But I really think that the thing that people need to see is a people, individuals, and as a collective church who have been transformed by the power of God, and that it's visible in the way that they live, in the way that they share their things, in the way that they spend their money, in the way that they give their time, in the way that they care for the vulnerable, the oppressed, the poor. Why should we care for those people who we might not otherwise even know? Isn't it because God has made us one with them? Isn't it because he said to treat them like family? Isn't it because he loves them, and anybody that he loves, we ought to love, because we're following him? 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And it presupposes that people will see some kind of difference in our lives and say, why do you live like that? Do we have enough difference? Do we live differently enough that people would ask about why we live the way that we do? Or do we live kind of like a religious version of the world? Do we live with boldness and generosity and hope that causes people to question? All right, that's the video for chapters 27 and 28. I hope you have a great week, or a great couple of weeks, studying the story, and especially not just learning information, but sharing your lives and allowing the story to shape you. That is more than an informational task. That is something that God does as we meditate on his word, as we live into his word, as we invite him to come and do something different, to make us different. All right, enough preaching. God bless you guys, and have a great couple of weeks.